Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zarate, to follow up on what one of my colleagues, Mr. Pittenger, was talking about, prior to 9/11, there was this like almost independent activity amongst the investigative agencies of the United States. Since 9/11, have you seen a greater cooperation, including in information technology, so that there is a greater sharing of resources and intelligence?
I think the answer is absolutely. Part of that is the necessity of the threat, of course. Part of it is the institutions that have been created to do that precisely as their mission. The National Counterterrorism Center, for example, some of the intelligence offices. Keep in mind that in 2004, the Treasury created the first ever Office of Intelligence and Analysis that Jonathan was a key part of. The only finance ministry in the world, by the way, that has an Office of Intelligence embedded in it.
And there's still room to grow, or are we pretty much, we've got the safety net in place?
No, but there's room to grow in two respects. One, there is need in the government, despite the post-Snowden criticism, for better technology to consolidate information. I think the reality is we do not correlate data as well as most citizens think we do, as the government. And I think that technology needs to improve. I think there also needs to be, as I alluded to before, a better sort of dynamic of sharing information with the private sector to understand where the real vulnerabilities lie in the system, not the one-off cases, not the one-off suspicions, but where are the real systemic weaknesses in key sectors. That is still to be done.
And those vulnerabilities are even significantly domestic, are they not? In other words, is there not a significant threat of terrorist dollars being invested domestically here, and that we're having problems following?
Terrorist, criminal, illicit, and they've often blend, and I think that's a real danger. You saw, for example, with the Hezbollah case tied to the Lebanese-Canadian bank, the use of 20 used car lots in the U.S. and financial mechanisms in North America to funnel money from South America into West Africa, back into Lebanon, into the coffers of Hezbollah to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And so there's no question that in a global financial and commercial system, the U.S. remains central, and we have vulnerabilities just like other parts of the system.
Any particular regulations or anything that you would recommend at this point domestically that we would use that aren't already in place to try to track the investment of these terrorist funds?
I would go back to Treasury and the U.S. government and ask, where are we on the beneficial ownership rules that are required of the system? This is part of the customer due diligence that's required of financial institutions by regulation. And the reality is we don't have a common set of expectations put out by regulation as to what that really means and what that means in terms of state corporation formation and in terms of how we monitor beneficial ownership in our banking system.
One other question. With regard to Dr. Schanzer, when you talked about the $50 billion that may be a signing bonus for Iran and the nuclear deal, is there any way to follow that once it's, I mean, do we have anything in place that would allow us to follow that?
Well, I mean, technically, if they move this money through the formal financial sector and you could watch electronic transfers, well,
but that's unlikely, isn't it?
It's exactly right. I mean, you know, you're looking at a country that's gotten very good at working through cutouts and through front companies. In some cases, we've been hearing about pallets of cash arriving in Hezbollah-controlled territory in Lebanon or in Yemen. And so that's, of course, incredibly difficult to follow. You've just got to have great intelligence of the fact that it's on its way.
Right. And in fact, would you say that there's a great deal of cooperation between the various terrorist groups? I mean, between Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Shabaab. Would one ever draw the conclusion that there's a terrorist central bank?
Well, I would say that Iran is probably the terrorist central bank in terms of the connections that it has across all these various terrorist groups. And there's this notion out there that Sunnis and Shiites don't work together. But as Juan mentioned earlier, there is a significant cell of al-Qaeda operatives and financiers who are based in Iran.
And I'll give you the last of my minute here to follow up on what Mr. Zarate talked about with regard to what would you do if you were in charge? How would, I mean, I know we want to work with Turkey, but if they're not going to work with us, how do we enforce? We have UN that does resolutions but won't enforce resolutions in non-UN countries. What would you do? What would you suggest that action that we should take in order to make sure that there's an enforcement provision to stop the flow of these dollars?
Well, I think there are a couple of options available, and all of them will make people a little bit uncomfortable because we have this very deep relationship with the Turks, a longstanding friendship, the NATO alliance. But I think that we could, for example, start to designate individuals that we understand are part of this trade. You could look at financial institutions as well that are part of these networks. Now, this could induce a certain amount of shock to the Turkish system, and of course, President Erdogan has
But
been
it may get
riding
their
high.
attention.
Yeah, it'll get their attention. And perhaps that could be, I mean, I'm not saying do it all at once and sort of drop napalm.
Right.
But really targeted
There's an
financial
incremental way to do
sanctions
it.
that could start to spook them a little bit.
Thank you. I yield back.